Welcome to Pretty Lies and Alibis. Let's seek the truth and travel the long road to justice together. What you know, Alibiers, welcome to another episode of Pretty Lies and Alibis. I'm Gigi. Happy Tuesday, although I'm recording this on Monday in the same shirt you saw me in yesterday, because I told you I'm pre-recording all week, and honestly, I'm just too lazy to go change my shirt 5 times, so you're going to be seeing Bob Dylan in his shades for the next few episodes. Big thank you to everybody who's donated and bought merch. I appreciate you guys. Music fact of the day, Brass in Pocket by the Pretenders. And one of the band members said it's a very lightweight pop type of song. There's nothing heavy about it. It's along the lines of the guy who's feeling very insecure, not about pulling a girl, but say trying to be accepted by the guys down at the pub. It's a front that this guy's putting up. It's like buying a new pair of boots and you feel great, but then you get home and you see spots in the mirror, or take a couple of Dexies and you're in gear for the evening, but on the train home, it's different. Pulling a girl means essentially finding somebody to hook up with for the evening. And Dexies are dexedrine pills, hope I pronounced that right, which give the user a jolt of energy. At the time the song was written, Dexy abuse was common in the UK, especially amongst musicians and club goers. The band Dexy's Midnight Runners actually took their name from the pill. So we are going to dive into this bond hearing that happened earlier this month. A lot of interesting facts came out in that. I wanted to dive in and do this. I've had a lot of people say, couldn't watch the hearing. Can you just break it down? I got you covered. The judge says this is a very dynamic situation and he would like to hear from the state first. The state said they were going to call 3 witnesses, and the first witness is Detective O'Driscoll with Summit County Sheriff's Office. He's a newer lead detective on the case, taken over in April of this year. He says this is still very much an active case and the investigation is currently ongoing. They talk about the 911 call that Kouri placed, and she identified Eric as the person she was calling about. She said he was cold to the touch and not breathing. The body cam video was taken. I just looked at the transcript. I'm not even sure if the video portion of that is out there. But Eric was officially pronounced dead at 3:58 a.m. on March 4th of last year. EMS said he had been dead a while, and the autopsy, as we know, revealed the cause of death was drug intoxication, with the drug being fentanyl. They talk about CL. As we know, she was the middleman between the dealer and Kouri, who got the fentanyl. CL also cleaned houses that Kouri was flipping and selling at the time, and she also would clean the family residence of the Richins as well on occasion. CL has a criminal background and is currently under supervision in another county for drug charges. The program she's in monitors her treatment and her testing. CL is progressing through the stages, and her personal outlook on her recovery is optimistic. Fingers crossed, because that is a beast to tackle. CL has been interviewed, and Driscoll has spent upwards of 10 hours interviewing her. CL didn't get any details with their case, but investigators did tell CL, due to the cooperation with their investigation, they would work with the prosecutors in the case that she was involved in separate from this one. They expressed the seriousness of the case against Kouri and the possible results of those charges, and also the importance and value of CL's testimony and the possible charges CL may face. Her testimony was more important to them than what they could charge her with. Really, a lot of this does rely on CL's testimony after watching this bond hearing, as well as phone location that corroborates CL's version of events. He said she was cooperative and she got to know Eric when she cleaned the personal residence. She liked him a lot and said she was really sad to hear that he had died. He said there was a search warrant executed at CL's home, and they found in her bedroom there was a mirror with inspirational quotes taped up there about recovery and addiction. And they also saw a clipping of Eric's obituary that we read in the last episode taped to the mirror. CL said she cooperated because she felt really bad for Eric. She told investigators in early 2022 that Kouri called or texted asking for fentanyl for an investor who had a back injury. CL told them she got in touch with an acquaintance. That's acquaintance number 1, who is a female. and asked to be introduced to someone who could provide her with fentanyl. Acquaintance 1 gave her the phone number of acquaintance 2, who is a male that could sell the fentanyl. She called acquaintance number 2 and asked to arrange to meet to buy fentanyl. And this was sometime in February when she met with acquaintance number 2 at a Mavericks gas station in Draper. And she got 15 to 30 round green and blue pills she understood to be fentanyl. They narrowed down through police records the purchase was made on February 11th of last year. After buying the pills, CL went to her home in Heber, and later that night or the next day, she met Kouri in CL's driveway and did a hand-to-hand exchange for cash for the pills. When this was testified to, Kouri rolls her eyes. They interviewed acquaintance number 1. It was the same thing that CL had told them. During that interview, acquaintance number 1 produced her phone and showed the investigator the text messages between herself and CL. February 6th, 2022 at 1:37 p.m. from CL to acquaintance number 1, it says, "Text me. I've got a question. Won't do it on this." She texted or called CL back. Acquaintance number 2 recalled he sold fentanyl to a friend of the female acquaintance number 1 in early 22 at that gas station in Draper. The carrier records for Kouri's phone show that CL's testimony was honest. It shows several phone calls and texts back and forth between Kouri and CL back in early 2022. The only thing is they could only see the timestamps and the sender and receiver of the text messages because the text had been deleted from both Kouri and CL's phones. In one set of calls on February 11th of last year between 5:19 and 6:52 p.m. in CL's phone history, CL explained those calls were to acquaintance number 2 to arrange the date and time to pick up that fentanyl at the gas station in Draper. The night of Eric's death, we just went through the body cam video in the last episode, but Kouri gave a written statement to police that same morning in the early morning hours of March 4th of last year when Eric died. She said the last time she saw him alive was between 9:30 and 9:45 p.m., and they had a drink to celebrate her closing on a house. After getting in bed, one of the kids had a nightmare, so Kouri said she went and slept in the bed with that child. When she woke up, she got into bed and felt Eric was cold to the touch. So she got up and turned the light on and saw he wasn't breathing, and she said he didn't look normal, so she called 911. Nobody else was in the home other than their 3 boys. Regarding Kouri's statements on performing CPR, she told investigators that morning when they arrived to her home that she had done CPR on Eric. The prosecutor says we're going to talk about Kouri's best friend and asks Detective Driscoll if he knows who he's talking about, and he says yes. Investigators found texts where she told her best friend that she did CPR on Eric before EMS arrived on scene. The text says, "I pumped so damn hard, so hard, screaming at him to come back to life." At this point, Kouri starts to look upset and she puts her head down and she has the tissues and she's just kind of rubbing her eyes. Like, I don't see tears, but she's sort of just very gently rubbing her eyes. The first EMS responder said when they arrived, they began CPR and Eric began to foam at the mouth. That indicated to them that CPR had not been done most likely before they arrived and started. They looked into whether or not Eric did any kind of illicit drugs. They interviewed people who knew him well, including 2 of his best friends that he had had since high school. And both friends said he did not do anything other than the THC gummies, and that was just on occasion. Eric liked to go hunting in Mexico, and they actually talked to a hunting guide in Mexico who they call TR. And TR told them that some clients, once they get to Mexico, will seek out a connection to get illicit drugs, but Eric was not one of those people. He was focused on the hunt. Kouri said in several statements throughout the investigations also that Eric did not use illicit drugs. They searched the home and nothing was found indicating there was any kind of drug use. When asked if there were any fentanyl found in the home, investigators said only the fentanyl that was in Eric's body. There was a second purchase of fentanyl initiated before his death, and that sale concluded after his death. CL said that Kouri approached her a second time about a week after delivering the first batch of pills. Kouri reached out and said she wanted something stronger than the first set of pills. CL told investigators she reached out to acquaintance 1 again because she had lost acquaintance number 2's phone number and was asking to get that number again. CL made other statements in Facebook Messenger about that specific request for the phone number, and both times Kouri got fentanyl from her, there were Facebook messages between CL and acquaintance number 1 about the request. The second request through Facebook Messenger was February 25th, 9:40 p.m. CL said, "I need those again, but more. I don't got a ride. I lost your friend's number." CL contacted acquaintance number 2 and met at the same gas station in Draper and got 15 to 30 blue round pills that she understood to be fentanyl. The second time she was meeting acquaintance 2, she did not have a car to drive, and she reached out to a friend that they call acquaintance number 3 and asked for a ride to go buy the fentanyl. He picked her up and they traveled from Heber City to Kouri's house in Francis. And Kouri said that there was a check under the mat at her house. Kouri rolls her eyes during this and says something to her attorney, Sky Lazaro. She made a lot of faces during this particular part of the testimony. CL said she checked under the mat and did not see a check, so she knocked on the door and Kouri came to the door. She said Kouri wrote her a check from Kouri's business account for $1,300 for the fentanyl. From there, they went to CL's bank and cashed the check. She deposited $300 of that into her account, and then they drove to that gas station and got the pills from acquaintance number 2. A search warrant was sent to the credit union, and they returned a copy of that check from Kouri to CL. Kouri was shaking her head yes. During this testimony, they showed it was cashed and $300 was put into CL's account, as she told investigators. Acquaintance 2 said he did remember selling fentanyl to acquaintance 1 2 times at the gas station in Draper. Acquaintance 3 verifies CL's testimony and showed investigators texts as well that matched CL's version of events. Several search warrants were executed on the Richins home. They found bug out bags, which are really tall backpacks. It's kind of the ones you take on a hike. They kind of remind me of military backpacks, very tall, a lot of compartments. And then they also found backpack-sized day packs. Each one was identical and labeled for each member of the Richins family. And those were seized. Inside, detectives found several items that would be useful in an emergency situation. Kouri shakes her head no during this part. He said the most interesting were documents that would be needed for travel for each individual. There were photocopies of state-issued identification cards for the children, and Kouri and Eric had passports and global entry travel cards. There was also clothing and toiletries. So that was it for direct, and Sky Lazaro was up for cross. She said, "You reviewed the body cam from the night Eric died, and Kouri made a written statement that night and said she made a drink, so they were aware of that. Was there anything in the body cam that talks about them looking for a glass the drink was made in?" He says no. Sky says they searched the home knowing he had a drink before he went to bed and made no note they had looked for any kind of glasses. He says no. That's a really good point. I mean, that's just a very effective way to cross-examine and kind of try to poke some holes in the investigation. Like I said, I think she's an amazing attorney. She's really good at what she does. I'd hire her if I were in a pickle for sure. She says, when you interviewed CL, she was working in a personal and professional capacity for Kouri, cleaning her personal home and the homes Kouri had invested in. The detective says CL said she did clean their personal home, but that was in another time frame. But during the 2021 to 22 time period, CL was cleaning only investment properties and also was getting paid by Kouri. Sky asks about the check that they got from CL's bank and says that CL was cleaning investment properties at that time for Kouri. The detective says yes. Sky says it very well could be that Kouri was paying her for cleaning houses. And the detective says, I don't want to speculate, Sky said, but it could be in spite of what CL said. Sky asks when they began investigating CL and if they were monitoring her during that time. And he says, yes, they were. and they started investigating CL in the beginning of this year. Sky mentions because you knew she had a boyfriend in Vegas and other details about her life. The detective says they learned this over the course of the investigation. She asks if they have CL's phone, and he said they did. She says, you reviewed texts between CL and Kouri during this February 2022 time period. Did you look at communications between them prior to this time frame? He says he's unsure. They looked into communications Kouri had with everybody. I've been traveling more this year than I have in a really long time, and I'm known to be an overpacker even when it comes to a short trip like the one I'm taking just this week. Base is the best piece of luggage I've ever owned. With the built-in bag for items that may spill to the built-in weight indicator and cushy handle, not to mention the 360-degree spinning wheels, Base has made my travels so much easier. I love the washable bags for your dirty clothes and shoes. You know, it's the little things I don't think of that Base did. So whether you're packing for a quick trip or looking to breeze through the security line, Base has your personal items covered. Right now, Base is offering my listeners 15% off your first purchase by visiting basetravel.com/whattheworld. Go to basetravel.com/whattheworld for 15% off your first purchase. That's Base, BEIS travel.com/whattheworld. You will not regret it. I own every piece they have, and I love it. And so Sky says you didn't look for any kind of a pattern of communication between the two, just focused on February. And the detective said it depends on what stage of the investigation she's talking about. And Sky says, I'm talking about any of them. Did you see if they texted on a regular basis and how far back they go? He said back to 2021. Sky said there's communication because CL is working for Kouri. And he says yes. And she says, nowhere in the communication are there any requests for drugs, and he says no. Sky says, you didn't make any promises to CL, and he said no specific promises. Sky asks when the first interview with CL was, and he said April 26th. Sky asks if he or anyone in law enforcement had prior contact, and he said not from their office. Sky says part of this came out of a raid or something that was coordinated at least with ATF and other agencies. The detective says CL's home was subject to a search warrant based on information they had gathered during their investigation into CL. Sky said that search warrant would contradict that she was doing well in what she was supposed to be doing in drug court. What was revealed was that she was buying drugs. And the detective says, we don't know that, but we knew she was associating with people who had active warrants for drug charges. Sky said that would be a violation of drug court conditions, and the detective says he doesn't know. Sky asks if CL was arrested, and he said she was. She asked if others were arrested, and he said he doesn't recall if others were on the date the warrant was served. Sky asked if drugs were recovered from the home, and he said yes. They also recovered a firearm from CL's bedroom. In the first interview in April, Sky says you begin the interview by explaining the dire situation that CL was in, correct? And the detective says, I don't have it memorized, but yes, we talked about it. Sky says you told her she was on probation in drug court for four first-degree felonies, and a violation of that is a potential prison sentence. The detective says it depends on the prosecutor, but yes. Sky says a first-degree felony carries a potential life in prison sentence. The detective says I would have to reference the code. Sky says you told her this would be a violation and she would be on the hook for the first-degree felonies and possession of the firearm. You also said the U.S. Attorney's Office was on board with screening drug distribution charges. There's a long pause there, and Sky says, I'm happy to play it if you don't remember it. And he says he doesn't remember that specifically. She asks if he remembers talking to her about federal charges, and he said yes. She says she's aware she's facing multiple first-degree felony prison sentences, but potential federal charges, and he said yes. She says in the first interview, she says she did not buy fentanyl. The detective said she talked about not knowing anything about fentanyl. Sky said that interview lasted about an hour and 20 minutes, and that ended with you telling her to think through all of this and let you know if she wants to cooperate. The detective says, yes, I gave her the opportunity to tell us up front if she was willing to cooperate or if we shouldn't even bother questioning her further. Skye said, is that after you tell her she's facing a considerable amount of state and federal prison time? And the detective says this is a common tactic that law enforcement uses to leverage charges for information that they need. And Skye says, you did, in this case, leverage charges for information because you told her you didn't care about the first-degree felonies or federal charges, but you cared about the audio cutoff there. The detective said, I told her I was interested in the information she may know about this case. Skye says, you told her Eric died of a fentanyl overdose, and he said, yes. You said you thought Kouri gave him the drugs. The detective says, I didn't specifically say that. She said, well, you alluded to the fact you needed information about Kouri getting fentanyl because that's how Eric died. The detective says, I don't know if I made that specific statement. We told her we wanted to know all the information she had about Eric's death. Skye says, you didn't care about any additional charges. You cared only about the information. The detective says, we told her the information she may have was more valuable than us seeking charges against her. And then Skye says, you interview her 2 more times, and the detective says 3 more. Skye asked if they were all audio and video recorded and turned over to the state, and he says they were. CL says in a later interview, investigators tell CL she needs to give good enough details to ensure Kouri gets convicted of murder. The detective says, I don't know if I said that, but what she told us needed to be specific enough to be corroborated, and it could be presented to a courtroom. Skye said, and you said she was screwed at this point, and if there's no cooperation? The detective says, I never made such a statement. Skye says, did you tell her this was her get out of jail free card? And he says no. And then Skye says, are you sure about that? And he says yes. She says at some point, CL tells you that Kouri contacted her between December and February to obtain prescription pills for an investor, and she does not state fentanyl specifically. The detective says, I don't believe so. And Skye says, CL tells you there were 3 transactions prior to Eric's death. The investigator says yes. None of the information they got from CL was perfectly chronological, and they had to piece it together over multiple interviews to get to the conclusion that they got to. Skye says, because you told her you needed something more specific to ensure Kouri got convicted, right? The detective says, no, we told her we needed more details on what she was talking about, such as dates and times. Skye said, but in the first one, she said there were 3 transactions prior to Eric's death. He says at some point in their interview, she told them there were 3 transactions. Skye says CL says Kouri was only looking for hydrocodone pills, to be specific. The detective said Kouri said she was looking for Roxy's, and she asks him what he knows about Roxy's to be. He said it can be different things in the drug world. It could be counterfeit pills that are meant to look like prescription pills or actual prescription pills. Generally, they're known to be opiate-based. And she says, so we're talking about Oxycontin, hydrocodone, things like that. And he says, yes. Skye said she specifically said she was looking for $900 worth of fentanyl pills. He says, I don't know initially, but she said $900 in one of our interviews, meaning CL said that. Skye says Kouri told her to leave the pills in an outdoor fire pit at a house in Midway where there would be cash waiting. The detective says she told us at some point she was told to leave pills in the fire pit in Midway. Yes. And at some point you sat with her doing house searches trying to figure out which house this was. Is that correct? He says yes. Skye said she couldn't really tell you which house this was. And the detective said she didn't know the address, but she was confident she could find it if she could drive there. So he's asked, did you drive her there? And he says yes. She asks, did you find if the house sold in January of 2022? And he says, from what I understand, yes. And see, this is smart. This is where a good defense attorney comes in, because she says Miss Richins no longer owned that home, no longer had access to that home, or occupied that home in February. The detective says, I don't know. Skye says the house was owned by someone else, and you say it closed in January of 2022. And he said, I don't know the dates exactly. She says, wouldn't it be important to know if CL is telling you she had access to that home and was there in February? And the detective says yes. And Sky says, that would be a good fact to know, right? She says CL does other interviews. And after being told, the audio goes out here, she says, then it's fentanyl specifically that Kouri asked for. And she didn't take those pills to the house in Midway. It was a hand-to-hand transfer. He said CL went back and forth in her memory on which instances referred to which transactions. Ultimately, she said she was sure the first transaction was fentanyl, was a hand-to-hand delivery in CL's driveway. She asks if acquaintance number 3 was there in regards to that transaction, and he said no, that was on the second. She asked if anyone was able to verify seeing CL handing Kouri any kind of drugs, and he said, not that I know of. She says now there's a third transaction after Eric's death, and he said she didn't say it was after his death, but only that there were 3 transactions. She says, so the information in the state's amended information, you don't know where that came from? And he asks which one. She says the one where she bought drugs after Eric's death, and he said, I do know where that came from. She said, you're saying CL didn't sell drugs to Kouri after Eric's death? And he said CL could not specifically remember the dates and did not mention she sold her some after his death. But when presented with digital evidence and other witnesses, she said that was most likely correct. So Sky says she just agreed with your scenario. And he says no. In fact, several times in their interviews that as we presented her with more information, it helped her remember more. She says, so you're telling her to be more specific. And as you're gaining more information, she says, oh, now I remember. Is that accurate? There's a long pause and he says, yes. On the transaction, you allege the check was used for, you said that she picked up the check and cashed it, drove to Maverick and got fentanyl. That third witness never saw CL give the drugs to Kouri. He said, no, he never said he saw that. Sky said there's no witnesses to say they ever saw CL giving drugs to Kouri. Detective says that the investigation is still ongoing, and he's asked, is CL still incarcerated? The detective says not immediately. She worked with the prosecutor in the other county where her drug court is, and they came to a resolution as to those charges against her. And part of that was that she's on house arrest with ankle monitoring. And she says, so in exchange for the information, she essentially was released from jail. He says, I don't know what happened after. We told the prosecution that she was cooperative. She says, you testified you interviewed 2 of Eric's best friends. And during one of those interviews, JS, which the interview happened on April 20th of this year. And during that interview, you discussed he and another individual were his best friends. Did JS mention Eric at any point during their marriage, say that Eric was concerned Kouri was trying to poison him? And he said, I don't think so. She said, so you present him with 3 scenarios. Number 1, Eric did this to himself. Number 2, someone else did it to him. Or number 3, it was accidental. And you ask him if he thinks Kouri would have done it. He said, no, in my gut, I don't think she would have done it. He also said at the time of his death, Kouri and Eric's marriage was in a really good place, it seemed. At some point before Eric died, he and his other friend had a falling out. The friend said Eric and the other friends would confide in each other about their marriages and they would just help each other through marital problems. Eric also told his friend about the trust document. He said Eric was upset about a relationship Eric thought Kouri had. The detective remembers JS was aware Eric had made the trust to make sure his boys were taken care of, but didn't say specifically it was due to the $250,000 revolving line of credit that she took out without Eric's knowledge. In the trust documents, Katie was made the trustee, and you asked him if they're doing so well, why not change them back? JS tells you that it was his way of ensuring that even though they're doing well, but in the event they got divorced, Eric would have the last word. And he says yes. Eric was on a hunt in Mexico shortly before his death, and JS said Eric was upset about what happened with his hunt because they paid an outfitter for a certain number of permits. They thought the guide had not gotten enough permits for the number of animals that they hunted. and he was worried about the legal requirements. The outfitter was aware that they maybe had caused Eric some serious problems with the number of animals they hunted. Eric had a heated conversation the night he died with that outfitter. He was researching the drive from Scottsdale to that area. JS believed the outfitter was actually connected to the cartel. Then she talks about CPR, and Kouri was advised to move him from the bed to the floor. Then the 911 dispatch told her to try CPR. And she asks, is Kouri certified in CPR? If someone doesn't know how, they may try and it may not be effective. And then she said, you referred to bug out bags. And she points out it's customary that people do food storage and pack bags in the event of a big emergency. On Eric's bag, do you recall a date on there? And he said, I remember his name. She brings up, are you aware the documents that were found in those bug out bags have now expired? He said he came on the case in April of this year, taking over as lead detective, and went to Kouri's home and asked her if she remembered that she coached his son in the past. Also, another sergeant that was there, Sergeant Hoffmeyer, says, I know your best friend. She coached my son. She asked, when he went to Kouri's home, you knew I was her counsel, and he said he was not aware of that. She says, you reviewed the entire case file at that time, and he said he went to Kouri's to introduce himself so that she would know he was working on the case. She asks if he was aware she sent a letter to his office that she was counsel in the case. He said he was not aware of the letter. She asked, did you ask her if she wanted a lawyer? And he said no, but her mom came and asked if she should have her lawyer present. He said he told Kouri, if you'd like to have your attorney here, that's fine. Sky says, after you had been talking to her, and he says yes. She asks if he remembers Kouri asking Detective Hoffmeyer why Detective Woody was removed off the case, and he said he does not remember Kouri asking why she was removed off the case, she being Detective Woody. He's asked, was Detective Woody removed? And he said she couldn't fulfill those duties, and now she's on patrol. Sky points out she went from lead detective in a homicide case to patrol. I couldn't hear his answer, and that was the end of cross. On redirect, the state said, you talked about if the police recovered a cup or glass from the drink she gave Eric. Were there any glasses near him? He says, I'm unsure. The state asked if the only information she gave about giving a drink were Kouri's own words, and he said yes. The prosecution talks about gaps in time frames with cell phones. What have you determined based on carrier records? And he said it appeared data from different apps were missing in the January-February 2022 timeframe. He said you laid out the charges CL had and the seriousness after that first meeting. How long until you started asking about the drug purchases? He said about 4 to 5 days. He said it was over a year from Eric's death that they started questioning CL. They showed CL the contents of her phone they seized, including Google Maps, Google Earth, screenshots from other witnesses' phone showing CL's communication with them to jog her memory. The state asked, is that an approach you use to jog people's memory? And he said, yes, people have problems recalling certain dates. Look, I'm going to tell y'all right now, if somebody asked me about dates that weren't a week ago, I'm going to be suspicious because I can't remember that kind of stuff. On April 13th of this year, you introduced yourself to Kouri. What's the first thing she did when you introduced yourself? And he said she talked. He's asked for how long, and the detective said 3 hours. She said she was glad we were there to talk because she had not been in contact with the sheriff's office frequently before that day he introduced himself. The day he tried to leave several times, but he said Kouri continued to talk. After that meeting, she sent Sergeant Hoffmeyer an email with follow-up information. I believe we went through that email a few episodes ago, talking about different dates that she had gotten confused. The prosecution enters in the audio and the transcript of that interview from that day. The prosecutor asked if they file it as private since they really didn't intend for that to come in at this hearing. The judge said it could be admitted for today, but they're not going to put it on the docket. The defense asked if you interviewed someone with the initials JS, which is one of Eric's best friends, on April 20th of this year. Investigator Driscoll had been lead detective on the case for less than 2 weeks, and they presented his friend with the 3 scenarios of an accidental overdose, self-harm, or homicide. Investigator Driscoll said he had a little bit of information on the case and was trying to keep an open mind on the case as a whole. And that was the end of that testimony. So we're going to end it here. The next witness is going to be a private investigator who is an ex-police officer for 20 years. And he went through the cell phone data with the Cellbrite software, which is how they are able to map out locations. It's all really good testimony. And I think you guys are going to enjoy learning more about the facts in this case. So we'll see you tomorrow. Hope you have a good one.